The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, a scent Margaret Hale had come to associate with endings. Not the dramatic kind, no slammed doors or shattered glass, but the quiet endings that arrived dressed as procedures, scheduled for 10 a.m., filed under docket numbers. She sat alone at the defendant's table. No folders stacked neatly before her, no whispered consultations, no lawyer leaning in to explain what would happen next. Just her hands folded in her lap, fingers pressed together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, as if holding themselves in place. Across the aisle, Daniel Mercer occupied space the way he always had, confidently, expansively. His attorney, a silver-haired man with an expensive tie and a voice trained to sound reasonable, murmured something that made Daniel smirk. The smirk traveled easily across the room, landing squarely on Margaret. "So," Daniel said, not bothering to lower his voice, "you really came alone?" A ripple of restrained curiosity moved through the gallery. A few heads turned. Someone coughed. Margaret kept her gaze forward, fixed on the judge's bench as though it were an altar demanding discipline. "I didn't know you'd given up entirely," Daniel continued, leaning back in his chair. "Or is this some kind of statement? Very minimalist, very you." His attorney cleared his throat, but there was no real reprimand in it. Margaret breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. She had practiced this, on the subway, in her bathroom mirror. At 3 a.m, when sleep refused to come, and her phone glowed with headlines about women who had stayed too long and left too quietly, the judge entered. Everyone rose. The room snapped into order. As they sat, Daniel stole another glance at her, this one sharper. He knew what the room saw: a woman without counsel, without armor, a wife who had been cheated on and now apparently intended to lose with dignity. The optics pleased him. 3 years earlier, Margaret had believed in optics too. She had believed that if she arranged her life carefully, resigned from her publishing job when Daniel's hours grew longer, hosted dinners for his partners, curated a marriage that looked calm and successful, it would eventually feel that way. It hadn't. The affair had come to light through a mutual friend's Instagram story, a tagged photo, a hand on Daniel's sleeve that did not belong to her. The betrayal had been mundane in its cruelty, digital and permanent. "Mrs. Mercer," the judge began, peering down, "I understand you are representing yourself." Margaret stood. Her knees trembled, but her voice did not. "Yes, Your Honor." A pause, a measured glance. "You understand the risks." "Yes." Daniel exhaled softly, a sound halfway between laughter and pity. Margaret did not look at him. If she did, she feared she might remember too much. The way he used to read drafts of her essays in bed, the mornings they'd shared coffee in silence that felt companionable instead of empty. Those memories were dangerous. They softened edges she needed sharp. As the proceedings began, Daniel's attorney laid out the narrative with polished efficiency. Daniel had been the primary earner. Daniel had maintained the marital home. Daniel sought an equitable division that, coincidentally, favored Daniel. Margaret listened. She absorbed every word as if it were being spoken about someone else. Each sentence tightened something in her chest. Not anger, not grief, but recognition. This was the story Daniel believed. This was the version that allowed him to sleep. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stood with practiced ease. "I'm not here to disparage my wife," he said, and Margaret almost laughed. "But I was surprised she chose not to seek representation. I offered to cover the cost." He turned slightly toward her, as if addressing a child who had refused help out of stubborn pride. "I assumed she wanted to move on quickly, cleanly." The judge glanced at Margaret. "Mrs. Mercer," she rose again. "I didn't come without a lawyer because I don't understand what's happening," she said slowly. "I came without one because I understand it very well." A flicker of irritation crossed Daniel's face. Margaret continued, choosing each word with care. "I've spent years letting other people speak for me. I won't do that today." There was a murmur now, subtle, curious. Daniel leaned toward his attorney, whispering something sharp. The attorney nodded, unfazed. Margaret sat down, her heart pounding. She felt exposed, but also strangely steady, as if the ground beneath her feet, long untrustworthy, had finally settled. The courtroom doors opened then. It was not dramatic, no announcement. Just the soft creak of hinges and the unmistakable shift of attention when a presence entered that did not ask permission to be felt. Margaret did not turn at first. She sensed it instead, the way the air changed, the way Daniel's posture stiffened. Margaret did not turn at first. She sensed it instead, the way the air changed, the way Daniel's posture stiffened. When she finally looked back, her breath caught. Evelyn Hale stood in the doorway, gray hair pulled into a precise knot, eyes alert and assessing. She wore a simple navy coat, her posture straight despite her age. She was not smiling. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's face drained of color. Margaret's hands began to shake, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to relief. Her mother had arrived, and nothing, Margaret realized, would remain uncomplicated after this. The courtroom had not expected Evelyn Hale. That much was clear in the way the murmurs failed to quiet immediately, in the way the bailiff hesitated before restoring order, as though unsure whether protocol applied to a woman who carried herself with such unspoken authority. Even the judge's expression shifted, not to recognition exactly, but to something like professional caution. Margaret watched her mother move down the aisle with measured steps. Evelyn did not rush. She did not smile. She did not look at Daniel. Her eyes were fixed ahead, steady and observant, as though she were entering a space she had once known intimately and had never truly left. Margaret's chest tightened. She had not told her mother the date of the hearing, not explicitly, but Evelyn had always been adept at reading what went unsaid. "Who is that?" Daniel whispered sharply to his attorney. The attorney frowned, studying the newcomer. "I'm not sure." That uncertainty irritated Daniel more than open opposition ever had. He straightened, forcing composure back into his posture. This was his environment, his rules. One unexpected spectator would not change the outcome. Evelyn took a seat in the first row of the gallery. Only then did she look at Margaret. Their eyes met. There was no reassurance in Evelyn's gaze, no visible sympathy. What passed between them was quieter and heavier. Acknowledgement. "You are not alone. You never were." The judge cleared his throat. "We'll continue." Daniel's attorney resumed, but the rhythm was broken. Words that had sounded authoritative moments earlier now seemed rehearsed, faintly hollow. Daniel felt it too, the subtle shift in power, the way attention no longer orbited him alone. When it was Margaret's turn to speak again, she stood more slowly this time. She was acutely aware of her mother behind her, of the weight of that presence pressing against her spine. "I'd like to respond," Margaret said. "Go ahead," the judge replied. She looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, at the tailored suit she'd helped pick out, at the familiar line between his brows that appeared whenever he felt challenged. "I didn't come here to punish you," she said, "and I didn't come here to embarrass myself." Daniel scoffed before he could stop himself. "Then why come without a lawyer?" Margaret didn't flinch. "Because this marriage didn't fall apart in a courtroom. It fell apart in silence, in rooms where no one was taking notes." The judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Mercer, please address the court." "I am," Margaret said softly, "just not in the language everyone expects." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the documents Daniel's attorney had submitted. "These papers tell a story where finances or facts and feelings are irrelevant. But this wasn't a business merger. It was a life." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Feelings don't determine settlements." "No," Margaret agreed, "but they explain them." A pause settled over the room. The judge studied her more closely now, as if reassessing an initial assumption. Margaret continued. "I left my career because we agreed it was temporary, because your work mattered more in that moment. I supported you when your name was smaller than it is now, when success still felt theoretical." Daniel laughed under his breath. "That's revisionist." Margaret smiled faintly. "Is it?" She turned back to the judge. "I'm not asking for mercy. I'm asking for acknowledgement." From the gallery, Evelyn folded her hands. Daniel felt something cold slide into his stomach. He could not articulate why her presence unsettled him so deeply. She had not spoken. She had not intervened. And yet, it felt as though she were already weighing him, measuring something he had spent years trying not to examine. The judge leaned back. "Mrs. Mercer, do you have any witnesses today?" Margaret hesitated. Yes, she said. I do. A flicker of surprise crossed Daniel's face. You said you weren't bringing a lawyer, not witnesses. Margaret turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at her mother. My mother, she said. Evelyn Hale. The name landed differently this time. The judge's eyes narrowed. Evelyn Hale? Evelyn rose. The courtroom reacted as one organism, heads turning, whispers igniting, and then stifling themselves. Daniel's attorney stiffened. Your Honor, the attorney said carefully, may we clarify the relevance of... I believe relevance will become apparent, the judge replied, eyes still fixed on Evelyn. Mrs. Hale, please step forward. Evelyn moved to the witness stand with practiced ease. She was sworn in, her voice calm, unshaken. State your name for the record, the judge said. Evelyn Marie Hale. And your occupation? Evelyn paused, not out of uncertainty, but choice. I am retired. The judge studied her. Formerly? Evelyn met his gaze. Formerly a federal judge. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel felt the room tilt. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, Daniel? But Daniel wasn't listening. His mind raced backward, connecting dots he hadn't known existed. Margaret's composure, her refusal of counsel, the quiet confidence beneath her restraint. Her mother. Evelyn continued, unprompted. I stepped down 12 years ago, voluntarily. Why? The judge asked. Because the law, Evelyn said evenly, is not immune to politics, and I was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. Daniel swallowed. The judge nodded slowly. You understand you are not here in any official capacity. Of course, Evelyn replied. I'm here as a mother. She turned slightly, looking at Margaret. For the first time, something softened in her expression. I raised my daughter to believe that dignity is not granted by institutions, Evelyn said. It is practiced, daily, often alone. Daniel could feel his control slipping, thread by thread. Evelyn turned back to the judge. My daughter was mocked today for standing without representation. I find that revealing, Daniel snapped. With all due respect, this is highly inappropriate. Evelyn looked at him then, not with anger, not even with judgment, with disappointment. You confuse legality with morality, she said. That's common, dangerous but common. The judge raised a hand. Mrs. Hale, we'll limit commentary. Evelyn inclined her head. Of course. Margaret sat frozen, heart hammering. She had not known what her mother would say. Only that she would tell the truth. Daniel's confidence, once effortless, now felt brittle. He had underestimated something fundamental. Not strategy, character. As Evelyn returned to her seat, Margaret realized the hearing had already changed. Not because of status or reputation, but because someone had named the imbalance aloud. And once named, it could not be unseen. The recess lasted 20 minutes, long enough for the courtroom to breathe again, but not long enough for Daniel Mercer to regain the certainty he had walked in with. He stood near the windows, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and clipped. His attorney spoke rapidly, outlining contingencies, damage control, ways to reframe what had just happened as irrelevant theater. Daniel nodded, though the words slid past him. What lingered was not strategy, but the image of Evelyn Hale's eyes when she looked at him, as if she had seen this version of him long before he became practiced at hiding it. Margaret remained seated at her table. She did not check her phone. She did not look back at her mother. She focused instead on the grain of the wood beneath her fingers, grounding herself in something solid. When the judge returned and called the room to order, she rose with a steadiness that surprised even her. Mr. Mercer, the judge said, you may proceed. Daniel's attorney resumed, but the tone had shifted. The questions were sharper now, more procedural, as if clinging to structure might restore control. He outlined assets again, timelines, contributions measured in dollars and hours. Daniel answered smoothly, but something in his cadence betrayed effort. He glanced once toward the gallery, then quickly away. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood without prompting. The judge inclined his head. You may respond. She did not approach the stand. She did not shuffle papers. She spoke from where she was, voice level, eyes forward. Daniel and I met when we were both still becoming ourselves, she said. That matters, because it explains the choices we made when success began to separate us. Daniel shifted in his seat. Objection? Narrative. The judge considered, then waved a hand. I'll allow it. Briefly. Margaret nodded. When Daniel started at the firm, the hours were brutal. We agreed one of us would absorb the domestic side so the other could build momentum. I believed that partnership was temporary, that we would rebalance. Daniel laughed quietly. You chose not to go back. Margaret turned to him. Because every time I tried, you needed something else. Another dinner, another trip, another favor. You needed me available, but invisible. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge's pen paused. Daniel leaned forward. You're rewriting history to make yourself a victim. No, Margaret said. I'm explaining why I stopped asking to be seen. She inhaled, steadying herself. When I discovered the affair, it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the clarity. I realized my absence had been convenient. Daniel stood abruptly. This is absurd. She's weaponizing emotion. Evelyn shifted in her seat, but she did not intervene. The judge raised his voice slightly. Mr. Mercer, sit down. Daniel obeyed, jaw tight. Margaret continued. I didn't hire a lawyer because I wanted this court to see me as I am, not filtered through someone else's language. I've spent years translating myself into something more palatable. She paused, then added quietly, I'm done. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was attentive. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Mercer, do you wish to respond? Daniel rose, smoothing his jacket. He forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. I respect Margaret's feelings, he said, but feelings don't change facts. I worked. I provided. I didn't force her to stay home. Margaret looked at him then, really looked. No, she said, you didn't force me. You just made leaving feel like failure. Daniel's smile faltered. He glanced at the judge, then back at Margaret. You're implying coercion. I'm describing erosion. The judge leaned back, studying both of them. Mrs. Mercer, you understand that personal grievances do not automatically translate into legal advantage. Yes, Margaret said. I also understand that silence often looks like consent. Daniel exhaled sharply. This is turning into a morality play. Evelyn rose then, slowly, deliberately. The judge looked surprised but did not stop her. With respect, Evelyn said, morality is already present. It just usually goes unnamed. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Briefly, Evelyn turned to Daniel. You mocked my daughter for not bringing a lawyer, she said, because you assumed she didn't understand the rules. What you failed to consider is that she understands the cost of them. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. Evelyn continued. You built a career on argument, on winning by framing. My daughter built a life by accommodating. Only one of those was rewarded. Daniel snapped. This is irrelevant. Evelyn met his gaze. So was your affair, until it wasn't. The judge raised a hand. That's enough. Evelyn inclined her head and sat. Daniel's attorney whispered urgently, but Daniel barely heard him. Something had cracked. Not publicly, perhaps not even legally. But internally, the story he told himself had begun to unravel. The judge adjusted his glasses. I will take all testimony into consideration. We'll recess for the day and reconvene for a decision. The gavel struck. The room exhaled. As people gathered their things, Daniel remained seated, staring ahead. Margaret gathered her coat. For a moment, she considered saying something to him. Then she realized there was nothing left to clarify. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with subdued conversation. Margaret and Evelyn stood near a window overlooking the street, traffic moving steadily below. You didn't tell me you were coming, Margaret said. Evelyn nodded. I wasn't sure until this morning. Margaret looked at her. Why now? Evelyn's gaze softened. Because you finally stopped protecting him. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. I didn't know if I could do this. You did, Evelyn said simply. Across the hall, Daniel emerged, phone already in hand. He glanced up and caught Margaret's eye. For the first time, there was no smirk, only something like recognition, edged with loss. Margaret turned away. As she walked down the steps and into the noise of the city, she realized the outcome mattered less than the moment she had reclaimed her voice. Whatever the court decided, something irrevocable had already shifted. She was no longer the woman without counsel. She was the woman who had finally spoken. The night settled over Manhattan with deceptive calm, the kind that made everything look resolved from a distance. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement, taxis hissed past, and somewhere above the city's steady hum, Margaret Hale stood at her apartment window and tried to understand what it meant to be alone without feeling abandoned. The hearing replayed in fragments, Daniel's voice tightening, the judge's unreadable expression, her mother's measured words cutting through the room like a blade that never needed to swing. She had expected relief. What she felt instead was a heavy quiet, as if her life had exhaled and now waited to see whether it would breathe again. Evelyn sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she had not touched. She had declined wine, declined rest. Her presence filled the apartment not with noise but with gravity. Margaret had grown up with that gravity, learned to orbit it carefully, learned when to resist and when to let it pull her closer. Tonight it felt different, less instructional, more companionable. "You were prepared," Evelyn said at last. "Not legally, emotionally." Margaret leaned against the counter. "I didn't feel prepared." "That's how it usually feels when you are," Evelyn replied. Margaret watched steam curl from the mug. "You changed the room." Evelyn shook her head. "You did. I only reminded them to notice." There it was again, that refusal to claim credit. It had always frustrated Margaret. As a child, she had wanted her mother to be larger, louder, to take up the space her achievements warranted. As an adult, she understood the discipline behind the restraint. Power that did not announce itself tended to last longer. Margaret hesitated, then asked, "Why did you really step down?" Evelyn's gaze drifted to the window. "Because I realized I was teaching the law how to justify itself instead of asking it to do better." She paused. "And because I didn't want you to grow up thinking authority was infallible." Margaret swallowed. "I still did." Evelyn looked at her. "No, you questioned it. You just didn't know how to challenge it yet." The phone buzzed on the counter. Margaret glanced at the screen and felt a familiar tightening. "Daniel." She let it ring. Again and again. On the fourth call, she silenced it and turned the phone face down. Evelyn did not comment. Across the city, Daniel Mercer sat alone in his office. Jacket discarded, tie loosened, the skyline a cold, glittering wall beyond the glass. He replayed the hearing with a lawyer's instinct for error, searching for missteps he could exploit. Yet every time he circled back, the same realization surfaced. Nothing that had rattled him was procedurally wrong. It was personal. That disturbed him more than any unfavorable ruling. He poured himself a drink and didn't taste it. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues who had heard rumors already, questions disguised as concern. He ignored them. What unsettled him was not the potential fallout, but the way Margaret had looked at him when she spoke. Not angry, not pleading, just finished. He had spent years believing her silence meant agreement. Now he wondered how many of his victories had depended on that assumption. He dialed her number again. This time, it went straight to voicemail. He did not leave a message. He had no argument left that would not sound like a defense. Back in the apartment, Margaret moved to the bedroom and opened the closet. Daniel's suits were gone. She had expected the absence to feel like loss. Instead, it felt like reclaimed air. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself finally to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. The tears came and went, carrying with them images she had not grieved properly before. The night she ate dinner alone, the conversations she rehearsed and never had, the version of herself she had postponed becoming. Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She did not speak. She sat beside Margaret and placed a hand over hers, firm and warm. Margaret leaned into it the way she had not done in years. "I was afraid," Margaret said, voice unsteady. "Afraid that without him, I wouldn't know who I was." Evelyn nodded. That fear kept many women married to men who benefited from it. Margaret laughed weakly. "You always did know how to make comfort sound like critique." "They're not opposites," Evelyn said. The following morning arrived without ceremony. Coffee brewed, Emails accumulated. The world resumed. Margaret checked her phone and saw a message from her former editor, a woman she had not spoken to in over a year. Saw you downtown yesterday. Heard some things. If you ever want to talk about coming back, let me know. Margaret stared at the screen, heart quickening. It was not an offer. Not yet. But it was a door. At the courthouse, the judge reviewed notes, weighed testimony, considered precedent. He thought about Evelyn Hale's presence, about Margaret's refusal to outsource her voice, about Daniel Mercer's polished certainty cracking just enough to reveal something less admirable beneath. The law could not account for everything, but it could at times acknowledge imbalance. Daniel arrived late, his confidence carefully reconstructed. He greeted his attorney, nodded at the bailiff, took his seat. He did not look at Margaret. She noticed. She did not take it personally. When the judge entered and began to speak, Margaret felt calm settle over her like a decision already made. The words mattered, yes. The division of assets, the terms, the future they would legally inhabit apart. But beneath all of it, something else had been resolved. She was no longer waiting for validation from the man who had once defined her margins. The ruling came. It was fair, not generous, not punitive, fair. Daniel absorbed it with a tight nod. Margaret listened, attentive, present. When it was over, she stood, thanked the court, and turned to leave. Daniel spoke her name then, quietly, not as an argument, as a question. She paused, looked at him, saw the man she had loved, the man she had outgrown, the man who would now have to reckon with a narrative that no longer centered him. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said. Margaret considered the words. "I already have," she replied. She walked past him, past the doors into the daylight. The city did not applaud. It did not need to. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was space. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret knew exactly what she wanted to do with it. The weeks after the ruling unfolded without drama, which unsettled Margaret more than chaos ever had. There were no sudden reversals, no public apologies, no vindictive messages disguised as courtesy. The quiet persisted, stretching into days that asked to be filled. She returned books to shelves, sorted papers she had avoided for years, and learned the unfamiliar rhythm of a life no longer organized around Daniel's calendar. Each morning, she woke with a brief disorientation, then relief, then a measured resolve that felt increasingly like trust in herself. Evelyn left the apartment on the third day. She did not linger. She hugged Margaret with a firmness that conveyed approval rather than concern and said simply, "Call when you want advice, not when you need permission." Margaret watched her mother disappear into a waiting cab and felt something settle. The space Evelyn left behind was not emptiness. It was inheritance. Margaret's editor replied the next afternoon. Coffee turned into a meeting. The meeting turned into an offer that was careful but real. Freelance work at first, a trial return to the industry that had once defined her sense of purpose. Margaret accepted without negotiating, not because she undervalued herself, but because she knew what she needed most was momentum. The work arrived quietly, paragraphs instead of praise, deadlines instead of validation. It steadied her. Daniel, meanwhile, discovered that reputations eroded faster than they were built. Not catastrophically, not in a way that invited sympathy, just enough to shift tone. Invitations slowed. Conversations ended sooner. He noticed how often colleagues referenced optics now, how frequently his name was paired with phrases like complicated and unfortunate. The firm did not reprimand him, it simply watched. That, he realized, was worse. He drafted an email to Margaret twice and deleted it both times. The first version was defensive. The second was contrite but self-serving. He could not find a language that did not center him. The absence of her response forced him into a reckoning he had long postponed. Without her quiet accommodation, he had to sit with the consequences of his choices unaided. One evening, he attended a charity gala he would once have navigated effortlessly. The room was full, the wine excellent, the conversation polished. And yet he felt oddly exposed, as if something essential had been removed from his posture. A colleague mentioned Margaret, not unkindly, and Daniel realized with a jolt that the story had escaped his control. People admired her restraint, They remembered her composure. They wondered aloud what it took to stand alone in a room designed to reward dominance. Daniel excused himself early. Margaret heard about the gala from a mutual acquaintance days later. She listened without comment. She did not feel vindicated. She felt distant, which seemed the more durable victory. That night she wrote until midnight, sentences stacking with a clarity she had forgotten she possessed. When she finally stopped, she read back over the pages and recognized her voice without effort. It startled her. The call from Evelyn came on a Sunday morning. "I read the piece," her mother said. Margaret froze. "You didn't tell me you knew about it." "You sent it to a publication that still mails me copies," Evelyn replied. "Old habits." "And?" Margaret asked, bracing. "And you didn't ask permission," Evelyn said. "That's progress." Margaret laughed, a sound that surprised them both. "I was afraid it would sound angry." "It sounded honest," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." They spoke briefly after that, about ordinary things. When the call ended, Margaret sat with the phone in her hand and felt a warmth she had once mistaken for approval, but now understood as recognition. The first time Daniel saw Margaret after the hearing was accidental. A crosswalk, a pause at a light. She wore a coat he did not recognize, her hair pulled back, her attention focused forward. For a moment he considered not speaking. Then the light changed and the moment passed. He watched her walk away, aware that whatever chance he might have had to rewrite their ending had already been forfeited by his earlier need to win. Margaret did not turn around. She sensed him, perhaps, but she did not confirm it. The city carried her forward. She had learned that acknowledgement was not the same as engagement. Weeks later, an envelope arrived from the court confirming final filings. Margaret placed it in a drawer and closed it without ceremony. She met a friend for dinner and talked about work, about books, about nothing that needed justification. The ease of it felt earned. On a quiet evening, she stood again at her window. The city looked the same as it always had, indifferent and luminous. She thought about the woman who had once believed love required erasure, who had mistaken endurance for virtue. She did not judge that version of herself. She understood her. That understanding felt like forgiveness. Across town, Daniel stared at his reflection in a darkened screen and wondered when, exactly, certainty had become a substitute for integrity. He poured another drink and stopped halfway, setting it down untouched. For the first time, he considered that accountability might begin not with explanation, but with silence. Margaret turned away from the window and returned to her desk. She opened a new document and began to write without preamble. The words came slowly at first, then with gathering confidence. She was not interested in spectacle. She was interested in truth, in the quiet recalibration that followed being seen and choosing to remain visible anyway. Outside, the city continued its relentless motion. Inside, something steadier took hold. Margaret wrote until the sentences felt complete, until the night gave way to morning, and the life she was building no longer required comparison to prove its worth. The invitation arrived in an envelope thicker than necessary, cream-colored paper that suggested deliberation rather than urgency. Margaret recognized the return address immediately. The firm, Daniel's firm. She did not open it at first. She placed it on the table and finished her coffee, allowing the familiarity of avoidance to surface and pass without taking hold. When she finally slid a finger beneath the seal, she did so without expectation. Inside was a formal notice of mediation, phrased neutrally, framed as a procedural necessity tied to residual financial matters. Daniel's name appeared twice, hers once. No message, no apology, just structure. She folded the letter and set it aside, aware that the past had not entirely finished asking for her attention. She told Evelyn that evening. They spoke over the phone, the line steady, the distance between them now chosen rather than imposed. "You don't owe him anything," Evelyn said, "but you owe yourself clarity. Decide which this serves." Margaret sat with that long after the call ended. She had learned that endings were rarely singular events. They echoed. They asked follow-up questions. The trick was knowing when an answer was sufficient. At the firm, Daniel read the same notice with a different tension. He had authorized it because his attorney recommended closure, because unresolved details invited speculation. He told himself it was practical. Yet as the date approached, he found himself rehearsing not arguments, but sentences he would never say. He wondered what version of himself would sit across from Margaret now that she no longer needed to accommodate his certainty. The thought unsettled him. He had been trained to dominate rooms. He was less practiced at meeting someone who no longer required his permission to exist there. The mediation room was smaller than the courtroom, less ceremonial, its neutrality almost aggressive. Margaret arrived first, took a seat, placed her notebook on the table. She did not open it. When Daniel entered, he paused, visibly recalibrating. They exchanged a nod. No handshake, no warmth, just acknowledgement. The mediator began with routine language, outlining goals, boundaries, time. Margaret listened. Daniel listened. Both complied. It was efficient. It was civil. And beneath it, something brittle pressed for recognition. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she kept her voice even. She addressed numbers, timelines, contingencies. She did not mention feelings, not because they were irrelevant, but because she had learned the difference between expression and exposure. Daniel responded in kind, matching her restraint, though the effort showed in the tightening of his jaw. He watched her carefully as if searching for a crack that might reassure him she was still affected. He did not find one. At one point, the mediator asked whether either party wished to add context. Margaret shook her head. Daniel hesitated, then said, "I just want this resolved." The words sounded reasonable. They also sounded hollow. Margaret looked at him then, really looked, and realized he was afraid. Not of her exactly, but of what remained once the argument ended. She felt a brief, surprising flicker of empathy. It passed. The agreement was reached without incident. Signatures placed, folders closed. The mediator thanked them. As they stood, Daniel spoke quietly. "You handled that well." It was meant as a compliment. It landed as confirmation of a pattern she no longer inhabited. "So did you," she replied, and meant it only in the narrowest sense. Outside, the city moved as it always did, indifferent to their closure. Daniel lingered, as if waiting for something unscripted to occur. Margaret did not. She walked away, phone already buzzing with a message from her editor asking about a revision. The future asserted itself without ceremony. That night, Margaret dreamed of her childhood home, the kitchen table, her mother's papers spread in careful stacks, the quiet discipline of that space. She woke with a sense of continuity rather than nostalgia. She understood then that Evelyn had not taught her how to win. She had taught her how to endure without disappearing, how to inhabit silence without being consumed by it. That inheritance felt heavier and more valuable than any settlement. Evelyn visited the following week. They walked through the neighborhood, spoke about ordinary things. At a crosswalk, Evelyn stopped and said, "You didn't ask me to come to the mediation?" Margaret smiled. "I didn't need you there?" Evelyn nodded, satisfied. "Good." They continued walking, their steps in sync, the city accommodating them without noticing. Daniel, alone in his apartment, sorted through old files he no longer needed. He found a photo of Margaret taken years earlier, candid, unguarded. He considered keeping it, then placed it in a box he labeled obsolete. The word startled him. He closed the box anyway. He began to understand that accountability was not a public reckoning, but a private one, iterative and uncomfortable. Whether he would pursue it remained an open question. Margaret submitted her revised piece and received an acceptance the next morning. The email was brief, praise restrained. She appreciated that. She celebrated alone, then with a friend, then quietly again. Each iteration felt sufficient. She did not post about it. She did not need witnesses. On a late evening, she stood once more at her window. The city glowed. She thought about inheritance again, about what was passed down not through blood, but through example. She had inherited Evelyn's refusal to confuse authority with truth, her insistence on restraint as a form of respect. She had added something of her own, the courage to speak without armor. The combination felt sustainable. She returned to her desk and wrote until the words aligned with intention. She stopped when they did. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was earned. She closed the document, turned off the light, and let the night exist without asking it to resolve anything further. Autumn arrived without asking permission, cooling the city just enough to sharpen its edges. Margaret noticed it in small ways. The way her breath appeared briefly in the morning air, the way strangers walked faster, more intent on destinations than encounters. She liked the season's restraint. It matched the life she was building, one that no longer required constant explanation. Her work settled into a rhythm. Deadlines arrived, were met, departed. Her editor's emails grew less tentative, more directive. There was trust there now, earned through consistency rather than reassurance. Margaret welcomed it. She had spent years being praised for flexibility. Being valued for reliability felt different, better. One afternoon, she received a message she did not expect. Evelyn, are you free for lunch tomorrow? I'd like to introduce you to someone. Margaret stared at the screen longer than necessary. Evelyn rarely orchestrated meetings without purpose. She replied yes, then spent the evening wondering whether anticipation was a habit she needed to relearn or unlearn. They met at a quiet restaurant near the park, the kind that favored conversation over spectacle. Evelyn arrived first, as always. The third chair remained empty until a woman in her early 40s approached, posture composed, eyes curious rather than assessing. Evelyn stood. Margaret, this is Claire Donovan. She turned to the woman. My daughter. Claire smiled. I've read your work. Margaret felt a flicker of surprise, then caution. Praise had become something she handled carefully now. Thank you, she said. They sat. Conversation unfolded easily, circling books, courts, the peculiar intimacy of public institutions. Claire spoke of her work as an appellate attorney, of cases that lingered long after decisions were rendered. Margaret listened, attentive. She noticed the way Evelyn watched her, not with expectation, but with interest, as if observing a variable she had long suspected, but never tested. As lunch ended, Claire excused herself. Evelyn lingered. I thought you should meet her, she said, not because of anything immediate, because she understands what it means to speak inside systems that prefer silence. Margaret considered that. I appreciate that, she replied. She did not ask whether this was guidance or invitation. She had learned that not every connection needed to be instrumentalized. Across town, Daniel Mercer faced a quieter reckoning. The firm assigned him to fewer visible cases, not as punishment, as precaution. He told himself it was temporary. Yet the absence of spotlight forced him into a kind of listening he had long avoided. He overheard conversations without being included. He read articles that referenced integrity as if it were an active choice rather than a brand attribute. He began to recognize how often he had mistaken momentum for direction. One evening, he attended a lecture on professional ethics, more out of obligation than curiosity. The speaker referenced a former federal judge, unnamed, who had resigned rather than compromise principle. Daniel felt the recognition land like a weight. He wondered whether Evelyn Hale knew how many ripples her decision had created, how many people carried it as an unspoken standard. He wondered whether Margaret had always carried it too. That thought followed him home. He opened a notebook and wrote for the first time in years without intent to persuade. He wrote what he had lost, not the marriage exactly, the version of himself that had believed winning precluded accountability. He closed the notebook and did not decide what to do with it. Margaret's days filled. She spoke on a panel about authorship and agency, her words measured, her presence calm. She noticed how often questions frame success as visibility. She answered by reframing it as alignment. Afterward, a young woman approached her and said, I didn't know you could leave quietly and still matter. Margaret felt the sentence settle somewhere deep. You can, she said, but quiet doesn't mean absent. That night she received an email from Daniel. It was short, no argument, no defense, just an acknowledgement of harm and an apology that did not ask for a response. Margaret read it once, then again. She did not reply immediately. She walked to the window, watched the city hold its breath between seasons. She understood that forgiveness was not a transaction. It was a condition she might reach in her own time, for her own sake. She drafted a reply that said, Thank you for taking responsibility. She did not say more. She sent it. She felt neither relief nor regret, only completion. Evelyn called later that week. I heard from an old colleague, she said. They mentioned Daniel. Margaret waited. They said he's listening more than he used to. Evelyn paused. That may be the best outcome available. Margaret agreed. She did not feel compelled to monitor his progress. The distance between them had become ethical, not emotional. On a Sunday afternoon, Margaret returned to the courthouse steps alone. She stood there briefly, not in defiance, not in reverence, in acknowledgement. She had learned that places held memory differently depending on who you were when you entered them. She was not the woman who had walked in without counsel anymore. She was the woman who had chosen to speak and then learned when silence served her better. She walked away and met a friend for coffee. They talked about winter plans, about nothing urgent. The ordinariness felt profound. Later at her desk, Margaret began a new piece, one that explored power without naming villains, accountability without spectacle. The words came steadily. She trusted them. Across the city, Daniel closed his notebook and turned off the light. He did not know what redemption would require. He knew only that it would not arrive through argument. That knowledge felt like the beginning of something, though he could not yet name it. Margaret finished writing and saved the document. She leaned back, listening to the quiet she had learned to inhabit. What remained unsaid no longer felt like absence. It felt like space held deliberately, ethically, with care. She closed her laptop and let the evening arrive without asking it to promise anything more. Winter arrived fully formed, decisive in a way autumn never was. The city adjusted without complaint, coats thickening, conversations shortening, light rationed more carefully. Margaret welcomed the season. It asked less of her socially and more of her inwardly, which suited the life she had been constructing piece by piece. Her days were full now, not crowded, but intentional. Work came steadily, invitations arrived selectively. She accepted some, declined others, learning that discernment was a form of respect, not avoidance. The essay she had been shaping over weeks was published on a quiet Tuesday. No announcement, no headline designed to provoke. Just a thoughtful placement in a respected journal, the kind read by people who took time with sentences. Margaret read it once in print, then closed the browser. She did not track engagement. She trusted that the work would find its audience without her supervision. That trust felt earned, Evelyn called that evening. I read it, she said. Margaret smiled. And? You didn't flinch, Evelyn replied. That's rare. Margaret considered that. She had once believed courage meant confrontation. Now she understood it could also mean restraint, the willingness to let truth stand without escort. They met the following weekend for dinner at Evelyn's apartment, a space Margaret had not occupied in years. The rooms were spare, orderly, softened only by books and the accumulation of time. As they ate, conversation moved easily, touching on the ordinary and the consequential without distinction. At one point, Evelyn said, "You know, when I resigned, many people assumed it was bitterness." Margaret looked up. Was it? Evelyn shook her head. It was alignment. I realized I could no longer inhabit a role that required me to justify what I did not believe. She met Margaret's gaze. I see that same decision in you now. Margaret felt the words settle, not as praise, as a recognition. Across town, Daniel Mercer stood at his own window, the city familiar and distant all at once. He had read Margaret's essay earlier that day, recognized her voice immediately. It did not mention him. That omission felt more instructive than accusation. He read it twice, then sat with the discomfort it stirred. The firm had offered him a quieter path forward, fewer marquee cases, more internal work. He had accepted. Not eagerly, honestly. He was learning that restoration was not synonymous with reinstatement. He drafted another email to Margaret, then deleted it. He understood now that closure was not something he could request. It was something he had to practice privately without expectation of acknowledgement. He closed his laptop and allowed the silence to stand. Margaret's life continued to expand in modest, meaningful ways. She accepted a longer-term contract with the journal. She mentored a young writer navigating her first public backlash. She began a routine of walking early, before the city fully woke, savoring the anonymity of movement. On one of those mornings, she passed the courthouse again. Snow dusted the steps. She did not stop this time. She did not need to. The building had become simply another landmark, stripped of its earlier gravity. In late February, Margaret received a handwritten note from Claire Donovan. "Thank you for lunch. Your work has stayed with me. If you ever want to collaborate, I'd welcome it." Margaret placed the note on her desk and smiled. Not every connection needed to be pursued immediately. Some could be acknowledged and allowed to mature. Evelyn, watching her daughter from a careful distance, felt a satisfaction she rarely indulged. She had worried years earlier that her own example of restraint might read as absence. Seeing Margaret now, grounded and articulate, she understood that legacy did not require replication. It required translation. Margaret had taken what she needed and left the rest. That was the best outcome any parent could hope for. Daniel attended another ethics lecture, this time by choice. He listened without defensiveness. He took notes. He began to understand that accountability was not a destination, but a posture, one that required daily adjustment. Whether that would lead to forgiveness from others remained uncertain. Forgiving himself felt even further away. But the work had begun. On a quiet evening, Margaret hosted a small gathering. Nothing formal. A few friends, simple food, conversation that wandered without agenda. At one point, someone asked about her divorce, not intrusively, but with genuine curiosity. Margaret answered briefly, honestly, without editorializing. She did not frame herself as survivor or victor. She framed herself as someone who had learned to listen to discomfort and act accordingly. The conversation moved on. That, she realized, was the truest marker of integration. After everyone left, she cleaned the kitchen, dried the counter, and stood for a moment in the stillness. She thought about the woman who had entered the courtroom without counsel, about the weight of judgment she had carried, about the quiet force of her mother's presence. She thought about Daniel, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He had been part of her education. That did not obligate her to remain enrolled. She returned to her desk and opened a new document. Not an essay, not a response. A personal note, written without urgency, addressed to no one. She wrote about silence, about how it could be used to erase or to preserve. She wrote about dignity as a practice rather than a prize. When she finished, she saved the file and closed it, satisfied that it existed even if it were never read. Outside, the city continued its measured pulse. Inside, Margaret turned off the light and moved toward rest, not as retreat but as maintenance. The story she had lived no longer required narration. It had settled into something quieter, sturdier, not triumph, not absolution, balance. And in that balance, she recognized the measure of her life now. Not how loudly it announced itself, but how faithfully it aligned with what she knew to be true.